Hello, I'm Elijah Rose, the soldier turned historian, and the topic for today is the legendary origins of the Arab people, this third part being on the available archaeology. Now, the knowledge we stem from archaeology can be characterized by one word: uneven. If you pick up just about any publication of archaeology for the Arabian Peninsula, you'll notice that there are extensive sources for areas that we have written sources for, but other communities, often just a few miles away, have almost nothing. The archaeology is also crazy overweight for cultures with better taphonomy. That's a fancy word for the science of processes that get stuff preserved in the archaeological record for us to find. It shouldn't surprise the viewer that most organic matter does not last very long in archaeological terms, but things made of stone, however, tend to remain in place until humans remove them. Archaeology is also overweight that are less remote, easier to get to. It's easier to find archaeological sites that are near modern developed populations. A caveat to this, it is actually harder to find archaeological sites that are literally underneath currently inhabited areas, especially in undeveloped nations where there's very little interest in history. One common issue is that bricks from archaeological sites have been recycled by locals, and some sites have been completely destroyed in this fashion. It is also harder to glean useful information from many smaller scattered archaeological sites than a single big sites. Because while a single city found in archaeology often has all sorts of evidence within that city, a single site might be hard to date at all. It might not be able to be dated even within a 1,000 year range. Now, the Arabian Peninsula has a mix of all the above problems. Most of the area is completely desolate, meaning sites are spread thinly, so many have yet to be found. Which is the exception to this, of course, is near the major watering holes and trading posts, which are densely populated and have continuous human activity. And there's often a mix of eras, often one on top of the other. The only good news is the desolation means a lot of things have been built with stone, and they're highly unlikely to be. The stones are highly unlikely to be removed in most places. Now, the downside to this is stone artifacts are very hard to date. So there's a fair number of artifacts and archaeological sites across the Arabian Peninsula that cannot be dated at all. It's simply proof that humans lived there at some point. You'll notice in the photo provided here, we have a animal trap, where you pit trap where the animals fall in. That shows that someone lived at that place at some point, but there's simply nothing found that would date it to 100 years ago or 4,000 years ago. For the earliest period of the Arabs, especially, there's very little archaeology, as this represents a quote bottleneck in human activity, where relatively few persons are the ancestors of entire populations, as we indicated in previous episodes. It is not all bad news, though. There are actually three alphabet systems found at various places across the Arabian Peninsula, and all these alphabets predate the current Arabic alphabet, and they've all been decoded. And so inscriptions on stones, graffiti and tombs and such, those can be translated, and those tell us something about these people. There are also enough artifacts spread throughout to show that the Arabian Peninsula was inhabited by Arabs continuously since the Bronze Age, even if at some point it was just a few scattered nomads. The major cities are also located, and they've actually changed a few times depending on the trade routes in use at the time, which have actually shifted with the centuries. Also, we find plenty of lost and abandoned items that have been imported or exported abroad, which tells us who is trading with who at a given time, which in turn gives clues to the geopolitical environment of who is giving who orders and who is a part of whose nation. Studies of the physical environment itself, such as rock cores that found weathering, can tell us about the history of the physical environment itself and how the climate has actually changed across human memory, and that does affect human behavior. And finally, this helps us resolve why there appears to be a genetic bottleneck in Arabian history, because we can actually find the Bronze Age archaeology, which shows how a large portion of the population appears to have lived in a relatively small area, as in they all may have lived in one town at one point. The bottom line is that more often than not, archaeology simply confirms and elaborates upon what we already know about from the written sources. Archaeology is not a substitute for written histories, but it can prove or disprove them. Archaeology is not a substitute for DNA studies, as archaeologists and historians often confuse changes in governments with the migration of entire populations, which simply do not show up in the DNA records. It may have major linguistic or cultural impacts, but it does not necessarily change genetics, and usually changes in governments have no impact on genetics. Also, how archaeology does not substitute for history is the most detailed and accurate archaeological reports occur when the archaeologists already know what they are looking for, and in case of the early Arabian Peninsula, we do.